Sort of the juxtaposition that we have when we take a look at Ruth today. So this is going to be interesting as we look at the book of Ruth in the context of this armed war in Israel right now. You have Ruth, who is a Moabite, and so she and this Ruth comes at a point in time for the people of Israel that occurs after the exile, when they're coming back to the land after being exiled in Babylon. And so what you have set up at this particular point in time is, and there's actually books of the Bible that don't agree with Ruth, because as the people come back to Israel, there's a movement for them not to marry women who are not Jewish. And it is often highlighted that people who are non-Jews, you should not marry them. And that was, I think in the book of Ezra, they were sort of railing against that. And now you have this commentary from Ruth that says something different. So you have two books of the Bible that don't agree. Shocking, I know. So it's an interesting time, and so the story itself is set near the end of the Judges. It was written after they were coming back from exile, but the time period for the story itself comes from right after Judges, and so. The interesting thing is we've been walking through the Bible. One way to sort of look at the people of Israel is sort of as a child growing into adulthood in terms of being a people. So in Exodus, they're beginning just to learn the rules. So think of them as a toddler. Don't touch the stove. That's the sort of stuff that we're talking about. And then they get to Leviticus. It's like going to preschool and kindergarten. They're learning all the different rules and regulations that they have to do to sort of manage in a society. And you get to Numbers and Deuteronomy, and they're beginning to be, it's more like junior high school and then the high school. And so they're sort of figuring out who they are as a people. How are they going to, how are they going to rule? Because once they left Egypt, all the rules and regulations that were on them from the Egyptians are suddenly gone. And I don't know about you, but if you look at kids going to college, since I can say that since I have two kids in college, they are experiencing their newfound freedoms, and they have to figure out how they're going to get their stuff done. And so once the people of Israel were free of the Egyptians, yay, we're free, but then how do you make everything work? And so that's the books of the Pentateuch sort of helping them figure out what is God calling to do, what is God asking them to do. And their leadership changes over a period of time. You have Moses leading them, you have Joshua leading them, you'd have these people leading them for a while, and then you had these judges who again were people who would be raised up. So if something happened, so like somebody invaded, so then God would raise up a leader, take care of the invasion or that particular problem, then they'd go back to being the people they were. And so they sort of, because the goal at that particular time was God would be their king, and they would have people raise up every now and again when they needed to deal with a specific problem. But God was their king. They would have no king for them. But you know how long that lasted until they saw how everybody else was ruling, how everybody else was sort of getting along in the world, where everybody at this point in time had a king. And so they said to God, hey, we need a king. And God was like, really? You really need a king? I'm not filling it for you? And they're like, no, you're not. And so then you had Saul come in, and then eventually King David, and then sort of that progresses us through to today. So the point in time we're at right now is Judges, and so there is not a strong central government when this story takes place. So there isn't these, kings and kingdoms and stuff like that. It's very much a lawless type of time, and so this is where this book takes place in context of the timeline of where Israel is at. Again, it is written during the time of them coming back from Babylon. So the time they're coming back and the story is being written is not the same time when the story is being taken place at. So it's sort of like writing a story about the Civil War today. So that's sort of just to give you that context as to what's going on there. So, so we're going to learn about a Moabite whose name is Ruth, and she does some extraordinary things. We also learn a little bit more about the sort of time period. And the interesting thing about Ruth, because Ruth gets married to a guy. I'm sorry, I'm spoiling the story for you. Sorry, spoilers. So she gets married. Ruth gets married when they go back to Israel, and their son is in line to Jesus. So for us as Christians, as we read this story reminds us that the descendant from Ruth is so Ruth again is a foreigner. So there's some theological implications in this. So Ruth is a foreigner, yet she is in line. If you're in the genealogy of Don, I think Matthew, right? She's in the genealogy, right? Yeah. So she's actually in Matthew's genealogy of where Jesus came from. So that's why this story is important for us as Christians as we read through it. So it's got a lot of implications in terms of the people of Israel, but for us as Christians, this story also has a lot of implications as well too. As well as if we look at in the modern context of the war in Israel today, what it says about Jewish people and non-Jewish people. So it's very, I think, very much poignant to this point in time. So, any questions sort of about all that background that I gave you? So, all right. So let's start. We'll do 5 verses 1 through 5. So we're in Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. These are the hard names, so whoever does this is brave.
Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband.
6 through 10.
When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people."
Let's see, 11 through 17. I'll make you read the.
But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me.
Okay. So there's some interesting things about this particular text. So again, we start off with the famine. So a lot of things back in the day were driven by food, much like today. You can't eat, you go to where you can eat. But it's interesting that Naomi and her family left Egypt, right? Because what does that symbolize? These are Jewish family. It's a famine in Israel, and they leave. What does that symbolize?
Should mean freedom for them.
Should mean freedom for them.
More
That's why they went to
prosperity.
Egypt.
That what?
That's why they went to Egypt in
Yeah.
the first.
Yep.
Kind of the Exodus too?
You could look at it that. I'm going to reframe it a little bit for you guys. Do they trust God? Do they?
Not if they're
Maybe
leaving.
Not if they're leaving.
Maybe not, no.
They're doing what we all do. God has promised, I'm going to take care of you in this land. This is where you're supposed to be at. And they're like, you're not doing a good job, God, so we got to take it in our own hands. We need to leave. So as we look at it from a theological sense, this family is not trusting God's promise. And so they left. So,
We all do that. We
Yeah.
think we should take matters into our own hands.
that's been every part of the Bible we've been reading so far, isn't it? We're taking matters in. God, God said we're going to do this, but God, you're taking too long. It takes you way too long to get what you need to get done. So we're going to split. We're going to take matters in our own hands. Hey, they have better food over here. We're going to go to Denny's. And we're going to have a Grand Slam breakfast. So they're off to do that. But unfortunately, what happens then is Naomi loses her husband, and then after the two sons take wives, unfortunately they die. We don't know the circumstances behind this. We don't know. We know it's a lawless period, so it could have been they've gotten robbed. It could have been just from disease. It could have been from any number of different things. And so now she's at her lowest point that she could be as a woman. Why do I say that?
Because she has no husband, no children.
Correct. She has no husband. She has no males to take care of her.
Nothing. Yeah.
She's nothing. Yes. She is completely nothing. There's nothing for her in that society right now. She's at the lowest of the low. She can't find food to eat. No one's going to take care of her because that's what the males did at that particular time. The husband took care of her. Then you had sons, so they would take care of you. And now she has two daughter-in-laws who aren't even Jewish. This is the lowest that she could be at this particular point.
And a foreign country, she doesn't have kindred either.
She doesn't have kindred
So
there.
no uncle or
Yep.
nephews or anything.
She's got nothing. She's got nothing at all. And she's in this foreign place. And she's like, what do I do?
However, you don't see her bemoaning her fate or complaining.
She was a little bitter.
Was she bitter?
She was a little bitter.
It said she was bitter.
Yeah. She said, God's hand turned against me. Yep. God's hand turned against me. Notice she didn't say it was my fault. God's hand turned against me for no reason at all. Because God was, God's playing God. And I did nothing wrong. That's how it always works, right? That's what our kids say, right?
Yeah.
I didn't do anything wrong, Dad. I don't know how the lamp broke, but
Because
Exactly.
Well, the reason I made my statement was because my note says, life had dealt bitterly with Naomi,
Yep.
but apparently Naomi wasn't bitter toward God. Well, the person who wrote this apparently didn't read the scripture
Well, you could say, so I could see that particular viewpoint because I think you could look at that. I think she's whining a little bit, which is I totally think is fine. You can look at it from the perspective she's just saying God's hands. She's rationalizing it. So you could say she's not complaining about it. She's just be rationalizing God's hand has turned away from me. This is what we need to do. But then we get to verse 6. Actually, no, I'm going to go a little bit further. Let's see. Did she turn it around?
So once again, she's taking matters in her own hands. But
Right.
is that what God is wanting all along?
So the thing is, she's heard that there's good news in Judah now, so that she's hearing that people are getting fed, and so now she's hearing that the Lord is doing a promise, and so she does something. She takes action. Okay, so the Lord is doing good things, so okay, I'm going to go there to experience what God is doing, and so instead of just being in that place of turmoil, instead of being in that place of depression and darkness, she hears about God's good news. She decides to do something about it. And so that's why she says, I'm going to go off to Judah. You guys can come with, I don't want you to come with me because you don't have any attachment to me.
Was she afraid of their safety in that and
Oh yeah.
Judah?
Well, maybe. They probably wouldn't be looked on well.
I have a note that said, why did Naomi tell Ruth to return to her own gods? Why wasn't she more concerned that her daughter-in-law worshipped the true God? Naomi knew Ruth and Orpah as foreigners would be socially at a great disadvantage in Israel. So she urged them to go back because she cared about them. In the ancient Middle East, people were seen as inseparable unit, part and parcel with their land and their gods.
Yeah.
So who would think that she cared about them? You'd think she's sending ways that, might be easier for her, I mean.
Right.
Because she
Right.
couldn't support them either, but
No.
she cared about them, that's the implication here, which kind of makes sense, I guess.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, she cared about them, and she knew that, like I said, they'd face some She would also face being ostracized as well too, because she would have these daughters-in-laws that were foreigners. So, and so then, so one of the daughter-in-laws turn back, and then the other one decides to say, "I'm going to stay with you and go with you," because of that relationship. The relationship she's had with her mother-in-law. Ruth stays and says, I'm going to go walk with you. Where you go, I will go. Who your God is, and so it really says, how important bonds are with other people when you talk about religion and stuff like that, because people will see how you act and how you do stuff, and then they want to know why you're doing those type of things. And so I think that was a powerful witness for as much as we gave Naomi and her family grief about leaving because they wanted to take stuff in their own hands, at the same time they still believed in God, they still trusted God, and so that's we see them go back into Israel. In terms of when this was written, so what this was saying to the people of Israel. So at one time you have Ezra saying, you only marry Jewish women. Now you have Ruth saying, if they're God-fearing people, that's who you should marry, whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish. And so people who are coming back to Israel after the exile are reading this text going, So you have two different viewpoints going on right now. And so I think that's an interesting sort of thing that's going on, and it's an interesting dilemma for the people coming back. And it asks the Jewish people who are coming back to look at, not to sort of stay inwardly, but to look outwardly to talk to other people about God and to have to be more than just who they are. So
I have a song in my head.
which one's that?
You know, follow me where I go.
Yeah.
I know. And it's
Absolutely.
at weddings. And I think it's so funny because it's a woman following another woman.
Yeah, yeah. You know, but again, like I said, and this is such an important thing, important concept that Matthew uses it in the gospel, his gospel. That Matthew says this moment in time, this story of Ruth is so powerful that you need to. He puts it in his gospel. You know,
What does he say?
that's who when he does his genealogy, he includes Ruth.
Oh, okay.
And so that
I
is.
thought it was a different kind of statement.
And
Well,
introducing the Gentiles here
Yeah.
already, that you're accepted if you believe.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So it's a real interesting text from that standpoint, and so and how Jews and Gentiles can work together for God's greater glory. You can take a look at the book from that perspective as well too. That Gentile helped the Jewish folk to survive. You know. And so yeah, so that's so what other questions you have about Ruth?
I have a question here.
Sure.
So they left, Naomi's husband died, the sons took wives.
Yep.
Moabite wives. They lived there 10 years, and then now she's telling her daughter, after the sons die, she tells them to return to the country of,
Go back to their mother.
Yeah. Go back
They
to your
were
mother.
following her,
Yeah.
and she told them to go back to where they came from.
They were going to go
I
to
see.
so they were going to go to She was going to go to Judah because she had heard that God was providing food, that things were going well there, and she's like, I don't have anybody here. You know, so I need to go back and hopefully I can find some kinsmen or something like that, somebody who will take care of me because I have no sons, I have no husband, I have no one in
No
this
kinsmen.
particular, because they don't have Social Security, they don't have disability, they don't have any of the safety nets that we have here. Your safety net was your family. So if your family was, you know, that's why you always went back on your family and said, okay, I need help. And then your family members were, yep, we took care of our family members. And so she doesn't have that family in Moab. And so she's like, okay, I got to go back to Judah. Plus, God's actually giving food in Judah. God's lifted the famine in Judah, so I need to go back there.
so much information, and it's, in the first 5 verses, all this stuff happens.
Right.
But the larger question
Mhm.
is, to me, what's the point of this? Ruth follows Naomi
Mm-hmm.
because Naomi apparently is a very good example
Yeah.
to her.
Yep.
And
Helps her.
Yeah.
it's a lesson for us, you know, that we, like Ruth follows Naomi, we follow God.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she's an example, and as Christians, we should be an example,
Right.
like Ruth, like
Yeah.
like Naomi.
Yeah, exactly. I think and I think it's another story that hints at what we say and do matters. I think so many times that we throw away our actions and say, well, that doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter what I say. It doesn't matter what I do. And it does, because other people will see you. Other people will want to know why you do certain things. And so, yeah, I think it's important that we realize that what we do does matter. As much times as we feel in our society what we do doesn't matter, but in our individual lives what we do really matters. And we see that through Naomi.
Or showing our faith.
Yeah.
More than what we would do,
Yeah.
more about how we show our faith. As
Well,
an
I-
example.
And I would say just how you live your life.
Yeah.
I would go even because showing your faith, I think, goes to the very fact of how do you live your life. You know, if you just show up on Sundays and are like, "Yep, I'm a Christian, and then you have choices during the week where you could be helping somebody and you don't do that, or you have very unchristian like behavior the rest of the week. Are your actions aligning with who you are? And it gets back to one of the big things that a lot of people don't want to come to church or be part of a church, is because they feel that people are hypocritical, especially Christians. We say one thing and do something completely different. And so this story reminds us that our actions do matter, that what we say, when we say we're going to do something, we need to do that versus, so.
Or what we want isn't always good for
Right.
those we love.
Yeah, it's not always good. But yeah, so I think that's, and again, we see what happens when we try to take stuff into our own hands. It doesn't always work out the way we want it to work out. So, but how often do we keep doing it? The Bible tells us time and time again. People are like, "Oh yeah, we're just going to do it because God's taking too long." How many times in your life have you said, "God's taking too long, I'm going to just get on to the next thing," So, it doesn't always, I'm not saying it never works out, but sometimes it doesn't work out the way that it could work out.
But
Everybody's
how,
in a hurry.
Everybody's in a hurry, yeah.
but how do you know if that's what he wants? Maybe he wants you to go the other way. How do you know?
How do you know? It's a great question.
Yeah.
Sometimes it just falls into place.
Sometimes it falls into place. So my personal experience is that's what I experience, is that when I start doing stuff that I think God wants me to do, stuff sort of falls into place. Like when I decided to become a pastor, one of the things was I couldn't quit my job. There was no way I could quit my job and go to school. Well, they've been working on this program where you could go to school online and keep your job. They've been doing that for 3 years. When I decided
So
to
he
do this.
presented you with the
So
opportunity.
there was an opportunity that had, come along.
I was thinking of this morning on the way down. How many hours did you have to spend besides your regular job studying?
Oh, 3 or 4 hours a day.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Would you study on a computer or?
Yeah, they used to have assignments. So you'd watch lectures. I still remember some of the time, if I had a reading book and I got called in the middle of the night, I'd pull out my book, read until they brought the patient down, and then do the patient, take them back upstairs, and read a little bit more, and then go home. Or
Sleep there.
sleep there, more likely, because by the time we got done with the patient, it was 6 o'clock. Well, I go home for 2 hours and come
Yeah.
back. So, but yeah, no, but when you're working towards what God wants you to do, stuff tends to fall into place. If you get more resistance, then I would sort of say, is this really what God wants me to do? If roadblocks start coming up, that would be how I would sort of measure how things are going. Hey, if roadblocks are coming up, but it's a good question too. But with the roadblocks too, is it just that God's teaching you to be patient? Because sometimes God's teaching you patience.
I've oftentimes heard it said too that God won't help you. He'll let you do things on your own. It's when you can't do things on your own, that's when God steps in to help you.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
How many people actually seek God's guidance through prayer
Yeah.
and meditation? Where they just do it, and then if it works out, it must be what God wants.
Right, exactly. Sort of like the story today, right? How much prayer did that go in with that? Well, we're just going to do this. There's no food, we're just leaving. But yeah, especially with my stuff with being a pastor, it was 6 months of prayer before I got an answer. So, and that was praying every day. I just pray in between patients and say, God, what do you want me to do?
yeah, in God's time, that's only a couple seconds.
Yeah,
Seriously.
yeah, for me it was just like it's forever. So, but yeah, it's stuff that's sort of when I know when God is moving in a particular way. It's just stuff just sort of falls into place, and I think the big one like what Don's saying, just pray about it. You know, what is that thing that you are struggling with right now? Why have you not been praying about it? And what does it look like when you begin to pray about it? So I try to start each day when I come in. I'd say a bunch of prayers, and I try to think about, okay, what is that thing that I need to pray about today, and what direction do I need to go, and that type of stuff. And so, but you know, how do you begin your days? How do you know, what's one of the first things you do when you get out of bed? See, the first thing you do is check your phone. Is it, you know, do you do devotions right away in the morning? Do you know, how do you begin your day? So. And one of the things I'm going to do this week is Evan challenged us last week to look at the Bible. And so I thought to help things out that I will suggest a reading each week for everybody so that you can, not necessarily the Bible study text, but just something.
Expand on that, Pastor.
Yeah. Just
Take it and expand on it, run with it.
Just have people read a little bit of the Bible. We're going to be starting Mark because it's the shortest of the Gospels. You might
People
as well,
can memorize it.
people memorize it. So, but maybe do a couple verses every week and just say, hey, I want you to look at the Gospel of Mark. And this
Because
is
what you told me last week, and just having a conversation,
Mhm.
you're probably exactly right. How many people actually open up their Bibles one time during a week?
right. And that's the whole reason why we started
And
doing that on Sundays.
how much time would it take to open your Bible and read for, just read one verse? I mean,
Yeah.
read for 10 minutes, read 10 verses. How much time does that take? Not much.
No, but you got to make the choice to do it.
But that's why God wrote that book for us.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I mean,
Yeah.
that's what keeps me on track.
Yeah.
Because I read it every day, and if I get behind a day, then I do go back, you know, so. I mean, that's a really good resource, you know.
Yeah.
That's what keeps me on track, so I do that every morning, pretty much right away. Sometimes I look at my phone.
And I went to the ELCA website, and they have a daily prayer,
Mhm.
daily Bible verse, basically. And they jump all over the Bible.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. But like I said, I think I'll just start us in
But it's
Mark.
very interesting, I mean, it's not scattershot.
Do we need to remind people that
Oh, yeah.
if you need help, here's a resource.
Yeah.
It's right out there free.
Right out there.
so.
We get that or our daily bread.
There's another one too,
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I always use this one, but.
But yeah, it's sort of asking us again to sort of figure out how do we listen for God's voice, you know, and then Ruth in itself is again a story about action, you know. Naomi hears that something is going on well in Judah and decides to act on it, decides to do something about it as opposed to just sort of listening.
And it takes how many days to form a habit? 30, 40, 50, you know, so.
Yep.
That's why I find something like that helpful because, you develop a habit and then you feel like you're missing something if you don't do it. I mean, I've had all these other things like read the 40-day challenge, and, and I get lost in that. I mean, it's,
You've got structure there.
yeah, it's just a better,
Yeah.
The other thing is, when you read a Bible verse, it may not be clear what the message of the Bible verse is. It might be somewhat more like a story,
Mhm.
or how God is impacting the Israelites, or something like that. So I try to write down, okay, what's the message? That's just to help me. What's the message of what I just read? Because you can read it and go like, okay, is there a takeaway here, or is it some kind of application?
we did a Bible study once in our circle, it was about prayer, and this was another thing that was really helpful to me. It suggested reading a verse and change that into a prayer, or reading verses and changing it into a prayer, because sometimes I feel like I'm praying for the same old things over and over and over, and it's always like I'm asking for stuff, So that was and I thought, oh, it's not as hard as it seems, so.
Exactly. All right. Well, anything else about Ruth for today?
I had to read on. I couldn't stop there. I had to read on. I like Boaz because Boaz does it.
Story.
Yeah, I like Boaz because Boaz does it the correct way.
Yeah.
He knows that there's another kinsman and lets him, he doesn't just take her.
Right. Right.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, no, it's a good story, and it's one that I think is helpful for us today, and just also to remind us that Jewish folks and Gentile folks can work together, can live together in peace, can support one another, and to have that message in a time when
You remind me
Yeah.
back in the day with, or mixed marriages.
Mhm.
And before, just black and white, it was the Catholic and
And
the
Lutheran.
Lutheran.
Oh, I know. Exactly.
Heaven forbid that you're dating a Catholic or
Exactly.
something, you know?
Exactly.
Yes, but it, you know, when they talk about the foreigner and them, it just remind me of the mixed marriages. And,
Yep.
The mixed marriages.
And-
Yeah.
Palestinians
Well,
and Jewish, Israelites,
Yeah.
and fall in love.
Yeah. So this story is a good reminder for us that, you know, that's where we should be at. How do we come together as different people, Jewish folks and Gentiles and different types of Gentiles? How do we come together and work together towards God's goal? And so in a time of war and stuff like that, Ruth reminds us that we need to come together as people and support one another and to be there for one another. And it's not blaming one side or the other, but how do we come together in peace? And I'll tell you right now, it's going to be really hard. But we see what happens when we come together in peace, how much stronger that is than when we come together in hatred. So I think that's a good message out of Ruth as well, too. So, anything else that you liked out of Ruth?
I didn't know she was part of the lineage. I mean, she was non-Jewish, but she's lineage to Christ. I mean,
Correct. So Matthew
so
includes
without
her.
all this, going through all that,
She was the great-grandmother of King David is
Yep.
how she fits into the
Yep.
genealogy.
Yep.
uh,
Yep. So you wouldn't have had King David. You wouldn't have had Jesus. Well, God would still find a way. But I mean,
Yeah.
but I mean,
Yeah.
but yeah. So it's through. So the interesting thing is in this, you have a foreign person within the DNA of the Jewish community as well as the Christian community as well too. You have somebody who is, and Moab was an enemy of Israel for a long time, and so.
So Moab, when they went there because of the famine,
Mhm.
Moab welcomed them
I don't know if they necessarily welcome them, but
as foreigners into
Tolerated.
their
they
land.
tolerate it. Yeah, it's like anything else. People tolerate you. I mean, that's wherever you go. You know, wherever you're new, people tolerate. You know, that's
Until you become part of their family.
correct. Correct.
Yeah, I read,
Right.
yeah, you know, I was gonna read this before, but, you know, I remembered too, so this is a surprise to me, I remembered there was a certain time when, you know, they were saying, do not marry a Moabite woman,
Yep.
whoever that was, Abraham, I don't know who it was, but anyway, I can remember reading that, but, there was a question, was it wrong for an Israelite to marry a Moabite? And it says, no disapproval by God implied here. Marriage with the Moabites was not forbidden by God, but no Moabites or their sons to the 10th generation were allowed in the tabernacle. So
Correct.
they got, that's how they, a little restriction. The Moabites, though not Israelites, were considered distant relatives because they were descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew. So as a
Oh.
result, the restrictions against marriage to foreigners did not apply to the Moabites.
interesting.
Yeah, and I think.
Not just Ruth. I mean, Boaz's mother was Rahab.
hmm Yeah. Who was the prostitute? So like I said, there's a lot of scandal within Jesus' genealogy as we look at it, or King David's genealogy as we look through it as well too. I think, I think we forget that, and so we tend to exclude people because we think, well, we are this sort of, you know, grandiose type of, you know, people, and we
Yeah.
forget
How do we
that.
treat the foreigner?
Yeah, how do we treat the foreigner? How do we treat the foreigner? How do we treat, you know, people who are different than us? And so that's so the message of the Bible, at least the message that I get out of this, in you know, is that we need to treat each other with respect and dignity and stuff like that. And then when we do that, amazing things happen, life-changing things happen. But the default for us as human beings is we don't like the people we don't know. We don't like people who are different than us. We don't have time for that. We'd rather villainize that other person than actually get to know them. So just so you know about that. So, all right. Any other
Is that your
questions?
time is up?
No.
I have a question about, you know, the biblical implications if Israel should fall. I know that Satan hates Israel or whatever, you know, from what I've understood. So what happens if Israel falls?
If Israel falls,
If Israel.
Are you talking modern day
I
right
mean,
now?
right now,
Yeah,
well,
God will not let that happen.
God will not let that happen.
and the United States will not let
Yeah,
that happen.
that's
So-
what I was gonna say.
That's-
Powerful ally, yeah.
Right, and I would say very. So I think, yeah,
Hamas doesn't have the military force to defeat Israel. They can create a lot of
Problem.
horror,
Yeah.
Horror
Correct.
and problems and
but
chaos.
it was a terrorist operation. The intention of that operation was not to overthrow Israel as a nation.
Right.
It was to terrorize their people and destroy this peace agreement between
Right.
Saudi Arabia and Israel.
And say, hey, we're still here.
right.
Look at
So
us.
many
Iran doesn't want-
innocents that,
Yeah,
on
that's
both sides that suffer.
yeah, and I think that's the thing to realize too. Yeah, is hate is very good about destroying people. Hate is about destroying other people, and while love builds us all up, love is a lot harder to deal with. It's a lot easier to hate somebody because then you don't have to really deal with them. When you love people, you all know this because you all have family members that drive you nuts, right? It's a lot harder to deal with that, but you need to deal with each other, and you deal with each other with respect, and it takes longer to figure things out than it does if you hate somebody. Then you can just write them off or do whatever you want to them, and you justify it to yourself. Well, they're not human, and we're seeing what happens right now of the Palestinians who are dying and the Jewish folks who are dying because certain people in those nations are treating each other as subhuman.
The thing
So-
is that this is going to affect then the Israelites for a long time because then the children growing up with the war now
Right.
will probably live to hate and teach their children to hate.
Right. And so that's how do you stop that? And that's the stopping the cycle of violence, and that's everywhere. You know, how do you just think of this? I think we talked about this a little bit last week. How do you stop the cycle of violence within your own family, and then how do you stop the cycle of violence within your community? How do you stop the cycle of violence within your nation?
One of the tragedies I read was there was a school at a kibbutz down in South Israel, and they were teaching the children Arabic as well as Hebrew
Yeah.
because they wanted them to grow up trying to understand
Right.
them. Well, that whole
Right.
thing was
Demolished.
destroyed
Right.
by this attack. I should also say Hamas wants other Arab nations to join in
Correct.
and create a larger war. That's what
Right.
they want. But they're not gonna be able to do it themselves.
Correct.
You know,
Yeah. So I think it's when we get to prayers, I think we lift up everybody in that place and hope that people will start seeing each other as people. People will start trying to understand one another and to love each other and to work through this. I mean, to stop seeing that violence is the way to go, because it's going to push like what you're saying, Karen. It's going to push back the peace process for probably decades now. You know, they were getting closer to having some type of peace, and now there won't be peace. So.
To me, it shows that we need someone to save us from our sin
Oh, yeah.
nature.
Yeah.
Those who say the human default is for good, just look at the world.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think of it in the spiritual realm, I mean, there's the forces of good and the forces of
Right,
evil, and
yeah.
this is the devil. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, all the hate and the,
Yeah.
you know, in the spiritual world, that he's, you know, you're fighting a tough enemy there,
Yeah.
because that's what his goal is, you know?
Yeah, to divide us and
And
not.
to divide
So
us,
what
and, yeah.
was in this peace thing with Saudi Arabia, or what was what were they trying to do with Saudi Arabia?
I think they're trying to establish economic ties, because once you establish economic ties, then
You work
both
together
both
a little bit
both
more.
societies benefit from it,
Right.
and
Do you think that
creates
that
goodwill.
they could overcome this and still do that?
It'll be a lot harder.
Mm.
It'll be a
Well,
lot
the
harder.
intent was to destroy that whole notion.
Right.
So
Right.
Saudi Arabia hasn't come out and condemned Israel, I don't think, yet, but who knows?
What's gonna happen with those Arab countries that previously did establish ties with Israel?
It's going to
Well,
be.
Egypt is right there. They're,
Yeah.
the Gaza city is right next to Egypt and Israel, right?
I
And
think
Egypt
that,
hasn't changed.
I think that was that 10-day war a long time ago. I think that was against Egypt, I
Yeah.
believe.
Yeah, it was Egypt, Jordan, and was there Syria? Yeah.
Well, the other concern is that in Lebanon, you've got Hezbollah,
Mhm.
who probably hates Israel as much as Hamas does. So
And that's
if you could have them attacking from both sides, they said that would really tax Israel's armed
Yeah.
forces
Yeah.
to have to fight basically north and south.
Right.
You know.
And they're supported by Iran too, aren't they?
Correct.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, yeah.
But the Lebanese people don't want nothing to do with fighting.
Correct.
I mean, they've been destroyed so many times. Israel come in there and blow everything away, you know.
But
Yeah.
probably they don't have control over that anymore.
That's the
There's
problem.
people in Gaza probably who don't want this, but
No,
they don't control their lives.
No, they don't. That's the problem. They're doing it and they're destroying their own people. you know.
Yeah.
So, but that goes back to hate.
What-
Hate doesn't care.
Yeah.
Before Israel goes in and bombs, they call these people and tell them to get out of their buildings and get.
Correct.
See?
Correct. They have been. I don't know if they're doing
They
that
used to
anymore.
do that.
Yeah.
I've read in this case, they're not
They're not.
necessarily telling, well, they're so upset that
Yeah,
they
Now
don't,
they're cutting
they hate,
off
they don't care.
provisions.
yeah,
No.
they're so
Right.
upset,
You
yeah.
can't bargain with Hamas, you know.
So,
So-
Hamas
Well, I
is
think they
interesting.
thought they had.
I mean, what they were doing was more civil. They would
Yeah.
call them up and tell them, but not after this occurred, I think
Right.
and there's always what, collateral damage, which is
Oh, yeah.
killing civilians, innocent civilians.
exactly.
Well, in every war, collateral damage is what.
What happens?
Iraqi war is the innocent people get,
Yeah.
Yeah.
women and children
Yeah. Exactly.
suffer.
All right. So where are we at for next week?
Second Samuel.
Second Samuel. Okay.
We better finish this Ruth story.
Yeah.
Right here.